Welcome to our series, Questions and Answers for a World in Crisis. All the answers are given from the writings and words of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Today's subject is indeed a strong one: ego. In Sri Aurobindo's The Life Divine, there are pages devoted to the ego and the necessity of abolishing it if we wish to progress to a higher state of consciousness, leading to a diviner life. A young lady sent this suggestion to me recently, and it is without doubt one of the most important questions of our age. In his thoughts and aphorisms, Sri Aurobindo has written, "When we have passed beyond individualizing, then we shall be real persons. Ego was the helper. Ego is the bar." The Mother explains in depth this aphorism of Sri Aurobindo. Quote, "It is the same thing for the ego, the self. In order to pass on to a higher plane, one must first exist. And to exist, one must be a conscious, separate individual. And to become a conscious, separate individual, the ego is indispensable. Otherwise, one remains mingled with all that lies around us. But once the individuality is formed, if one wants to rise to a higher level and live a spiritual life, if one wants even to become simply a higher type of man, the limitations of the ego are the worst obstacles, and the ego must be surpassed in order to enter the true consciousness." And here follow many quotes by Mother. "All bitterness in life always comes from the ego refusing to abdicate. All that happens is to teach us one and the same lesson. Unless we get rid of our ego, there is no peace either for ourselves or for others. And without ego, life becomes such a wonderful marvel. Yet, those who live in their ego live constantly in an ugly drama. If people were a little less selfish, things would not be so bad. Meanwhile, we must meet all these adverse circumstances with patience, endurance, and equanimity. It is not the soul, but the ego and its pride that feel defeat and humiliation. Without the play of ego, there would be no conflicts. And if there were not in the vital a tendency to drama, there would be no dramatic happenings in life. The extent of your difficulties gives you the measure of your ego. 23rd March, 1957. From Sri Aurobindo. The essential of the sacrifice of works must be there, and the essential is the surrender of all desire for the fruit of our works, the renunciation of all attachment to the result for which we yet labor. For so long as we work with attachment to the result, the sacrifice is offered not to the divine, but to our ego. We may think otherwise, but we are deceiving ourselves. We are making our idea of the divine, our sense of duty, our feeling for our fellow creatures, our idea of what is good for the world or others, even our obedience to the Master, a mask for our egoistic satisfactions and preferences, and a specious shield against the demand made on us to root all desire out of our nature. Here too, in this movement by which the soul divests itself gradually of the obscure robe of the ego, there is a progress by marked stages. For not only the fruit of works belongs to the Lord alone, but our works also must be His. He is the true Lord of our action, no less than of our results. And from the Mother. Egoism is a relatively easy thing to correct, because everyone knows what it is. It is easy to discover, easy to correct if one truly wants to do it and is bent on it. But the ego is much more difficult to seize, because in fact, to realize what the ego is, one must already be out of it. Otherwise, one cannot find it out. You are wholly molded from it, from head to foot, from the outermost to the innermost, from the physical to the spiritual. You are steeped in ego. It is mixed with everything, and you are not aware of what it is. You must have already conquered it, come out of it, freed yourself from it, at least partially, at least in some little corner of your being somewhere, in order to realize what ego is. The ego is what helps us to individualize ourselves, and what prevents us from becoming divine. It is like that. Put that together, and you will find the ego. Without the ego, the world is organized. There would be no individual. And without the ego, the world cannot become divine. It would be logical to conclude, well, let us first of all become conscious individuals, and then we shall send away the ego and become divine. Only when we have become conscious individuals, we have grown so accustomed to living with our ego that we are no longer able to discern it, and much labor is needed to become aware of its presence. The ego is what makes one conscious of being separate from others. If there were no ego, you would not perceive that you are a person separate from others. You would have the impression that you are a small part of a whole, a very small part of a very great whole. On the other hand, every one of you is most certainly quite conscious of being a separate person. Well, it is the ego that gives you this impression. As long as you are conscious in this way, it means that you have an ego. When you begin to be aware that everything is yourself, and that this is only a very small point in the midst of thousands and thousands of other points of the same person, that you are everywhere. When you feel that you are yourself in everything, and that there is no separation, then you know that you are on the way towards having no more ego. But if, through effort, through discipline, through progressive mastery, you surmount your ego and go beyond it, even if only in the tiniest part of your being, this acts like the opening of a small window somewhere. And by looking carefully through the window, you will be able to glimpse the supermind. And that is a promise. When you glimpse it, you will find it so beautiful that you immediately want to get rid of all the rest, of the ego. And again, from Sri Aurobindo. The truth is not that God moves round the ego as the center of existence and can be judged by the ego and its view of the dualities, but that the divine is itself the center, and that the experience of the individual only finds its own true truth when it is known in the terms of the universal and the transcendent. The formation of a mental and vital ego tied to the body sense was the first great labor of the cosmic life in its progressive evolution. For this was the means it found for creating out of matter a conscious individual. The dissolution of this limiting ego is the one condition, the necessary means for this very same life to arrive at its divine fruition. For only so can the conscious individual find either his transcendent self or his true person. Amidst these various and conflicting opinions, the seeker of the truth has to decide for himself which shall be for him the knowledge. But if our aim is a spiritual release or a spiritual fulfillment, then the exceeding of this little mold of ego is imperative. In human egoism and its satisfaction, there can be no divine culmination and deliverance. A certain purification from egoism is the condition even of ethical progress and elevation, for social good and perfection. Much more is it indispensable for inner peace, purity, and joy. But much more radical deliverance, not only from egoism, but from ego idea and ego sense, is needed if our aim is to raise human into divine nature. Experience shows that in proportion as we deliver ourselves from the limiting mental and vital ego, we command a wider life, a larger existence, a higher consciousness, a happier soul state, even a greater knowledge, power, and scope. Even the aim which the most mundane philosophy pursues, the fulfillment, perfection, satisfaction of the individual, is best assured not by satisfying the narrow ego, but by finding freedom in a higher and larger self. There is no happiness in smallness of the being, says the scripture. It is with the large being that happiness comes. The ego is by its nature a smallness of being. It brings contraction of the consciousness, and with the contraction, limitation of knowledge, disabling ignorance, confinement, and a diminution of power, and by that diminution, incapacity and weakness, scission of oneness, and by that scission, disharmony, and failure of sympathy and love and understanding, inhibition or fragmentation of delight of being, and by that fragmentation, pain and sorrow. To recover what is lost, we must break out of the walls of ego. The ego must either disappear in impersonality or fuse into a larger I. It must fuse into the wider cosmic I, which comprehends all these smaller selves, or the transcendent, of which even the cosmic self is a diminished image.